Is there any other option?
Hey guys, can we, women, men, whatever, what I'd like to do, I'd like to get the program started. First of all, if you enjoyed the breakfast, the spread, the lox, the bagels, the cream cheese, everything else, you might want to consider leaving a donation to help defray the cost. There's a plate up there, and somebody already gave $10. Please keep that in mind. At this point, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. I won't use the line that the rabbi uses, but please just turn it off or put it on mute. Thank you. We are honored this morning to have Dr. Simon Seibelman. If you don't know him, Dr. Seibelman is a Leon Distinguished Professor of Judaic, Holocaust, and Peace Studies, and the Director of the Center for Judaic, Holocaust, and Peace Studies at App State for the past 1 year and 4 months?
1 year and 4 months, 5 months, who counts?
And 2 hours and 3 minutes, okay.
Who counts?
Before that, Dr. Seibelman was Executive Director of the Virginia Holocaust Museum, which worked from 2009 to 2014. Prior to that, he was co-chair and professor in the Department of Foreign Language and Literature at University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh. His academic training is in French, focusing on France during World War II and the Holocaust. Specifically, he has researched Jewish identity in France and the post-war French views of Nazi occupation. He has participated in over 50 conference presentations, published dozens of scholarly articles, and has plans for numerous additional publications. And I'm also very pleased to say he's a good personal friend of mine. Please put your hands together for Dr. Seibelman.
Thank you all. Several weeks ago, when I was here for the services, Shabbat services led by Hillel, the question was, what are you going to talk about? And I said, well, I'm going to talk about 3 Jews whom you think you know. And everyone said, well, tell us more, tell us more. It's like, no, let's leave it a mystery. And that is really what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about 3 biblical characters that we really think we know, simply because they are part and parcel of our Jewish heritage, of a Western Judeo-Christian heritage, of a literary heritage in the West. And so we really believe we know these individuals. Now, who are they? I am going to be dealing with, first of all, Yitzchak, Isaac. We all know him. We know his stories. Secondly, Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, the first king of Israel. And the third, to get a bit of gender balancing here, Esther HaMalka, Queen Esther. 3 characters that we really believe we know a lot about. And what I'm going to hope to do today is present to you some new information about these 3 characters, and also to point out something that is intrinsically part of the Jewish tradition. When we read Tanakh, when we read the Bible in its entirety, by the way, did you realize that I chose 1 character from Torah, 1 character from Nevi'im, the prophets, and 1 character from Ketuvim, the writings. So we literally take in the entirety of Tanakh. And the reason I did that was simply because when we look at biblical characters, they're often 2-dimensional. They come on, they've got a little story, they present a message, and then they're gone. And so the ancient rabbis, and in fact even the medieval rabbis, are going to begin to flesh these creatures out. And they do that through midrash. These are rabbinical stories that tell us more about these two-dimensional individuals and expand so that they seem far more human. For example, a character I'm not going to talk about other than in passing, but I'm using her as an example right now. Sarah, the first Jewish mother. What do we know about her? Tell me what we know about her. She was old, okay? And yet, when we first meet her in the story, she is young, and she remains young, sensual, sexual, vivacious, because she attracts the eye of Paro, of Pharaoh in Egypt. She attracts the eye of Abimelech, a Canaanite king. And literally, Abraham says, Pharaoh, you like her? Here, she's my sister, take her. He's thinking of himself. So we know her as being old. Why do we think of her as being old? Okay, how old was she when she gave birth to Isaac? She was 90 years old. Well, as in growing up in Richmond, Virginia, the Rebbitzin that I remember most, when she heard some of these stories, she said, 90, it's because Abraham drove her crazy. She was actually 35. But whatever, so we know that she was old. What else do we know about her? Her name is changed. She is one of 4 characters in TOHC who have their names changed by the addition of a single letter. Now, Jacob, he has a totally new name. He goes from Jacob to being Israel. So her name is going to be changed.
Well, she was Joseph, Hagar, and Brother.
Okay, we have the whole story of Hagar. Literally, when Hagar gives birth, the child is given birth and is placed on her knees. And this is to be a sign that this is her child, her surrogate child. And yet, as the story develops, we know that Sarah becomes increasingly jealous of Hagar and of Ishmael's presence in the household. And she becomes very harsh. And what the ancient rabbis do, they explain the harshness, that she had a hard heart. And they said she always had a hard heart. And they go back to when she went to Pharaoh and when she went to Abimelech. She went willingly because Abraham was a cold husband. And they begin to flesh her out. She becomes a being with a psyche. Why is she this way? Well, she has basically been, we might call her an abused wife. She has tried to do her best with her husband, and the rabbis give us a whole series of stories. They also indicate that within Torah, the Almighty never speaks to her. And yet within conservative and Reformed Judaism today, when we do the Amidah, we don't simply do the 3 patriarchs, you repeat then the 4 matriarchs. And yet we know that the Almighty never speaks to any of them. And so what does the Midrash do? The Midrash goes in and tells us God spoke to her. And this is how she knew what she had to do. She realized that Hagar and Ishmael had to go if God's great wish would come to fruition.
Quick question.
Sure.
How do we know all this stuff? That degree of detail from so far back.
It's all been written down. It's all part of our written as well as an oral tradition.
Who wrote it?
These were written by the rabbis of antiquity. And literally there are 9 generations who passed down. And in fact, in oral cultures, anthropologically speaking, oral cultures, you will have 1 or 2 people in that culture who know a great deal more than anyone else, and they pass it down orally. That was undoubtedly what happened in the case of Jews, and it begins to be put down. The Midrash it begins to be written in the 1st century before the Common Era, and it continues until the 6th century of the Common Era. So 700 years of writing down these commentaries.
What's the problem? I'll shut up if you want.
Well, we're not looking, these stories were not to be accurate, to be historically accurate. They are, in fact, traditional Jewish ways of trying to make sense of stories that don't seem to make sense, or where there are holes in the story. So that is why we do it. Alrighty, so let's come back then to what I'm going to deal with, and that is these three biblical characters. Isaac. What do we know about Isaac?
His father was about to sacrifice.
Okay, there is the story of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac. Alrighty, so we know that about him. What else do we know about him?
We know that he doesn't come back.
We know that he doesn't come back from that experience. And yet, 4 chapters later in Genesis, he's there. What else do we know about him?
A rabbi once told me, or us, that there was real question about his mental capacities.
Okay, there was question about his mental capacity for some people. Anything else that we know about him? Virtually, we know very little about him. The biblical story tells us very, very little. And yet, there are all sorts of clues about him. First of all, his mother is 90 when he's born. How old is his father?
More than that.
More than that. He's 100. Okay? So we have a baby born of 2 elderly parents who've been waiting for this child all their life. What more does that tell us about how the parents are going to treat him? He was a precious child. He was a prince. He was going to be spoiled like crazy. And yet, it's not in the story. It is not in the story. We know nothing about him from the day of his circumcision at 8 days old until later on when his father will take him with him on a journey to Mount Moriah, and there he will bind him and prepare to sacrifice him, carrying out God's command. What age was he? How old was Isaac when the binding occurs? He was in his 30s. The reason we know that, he was 34 years old. His mother is 90 when she gives birth. And the story after the binding is called Chaya Soha, the lives of Sarah. And we know that she dies at the age of 124. So that he would have been 34 years old. Iconographically, artistically, most people show him being a child. And yet, he is not a child. He is a full-grown adult. He is a full-grown adult who had to have recognized through the questions, the very few things that he and his father say to one another on their way to Moriah, he will have known that there is no sacrifice. We've not brought a ram or a lamb or a calf. We simply got the wood, we have the knife, and we have the fire. A fully grown man would recognize, I am the sacrifice. And indeed, the rabbis suggest in the Midrash that when the time came for Isaac to be bound, that Isaac actually helps his father bind him. So he is doing this willingly, just as Abraham is doing this willingly. Now that again tells us something about him. If you are a precious child, if you are an individual who is spoiled, if you are the prince of the household, you always want to please your parents. And so this would be a way of pleasing your father, that he is going to kill you. In reading the biblical story over and over, we have one Hebrew word that is repeated on their journey, and the Hebrew word is yachdav. It means together. Abraham and Isaac are walking together. They are going to a place together. And as we indicated just a little while ago, something we know about him, when Abraham comes down, he's echad. He's one. He's alone. Isaac isn't there. Mystery. And in the next Parsha, Chayasova, we know that he is initially not there. But we also know, and he's not even at his mother's funeral. Abraham buries Sarah. Isaac is not there. Where is Isaac? Well, this was a conundrum. We need to explain this. And so the ancient rabbis in Midrash give us an explanation. The first and the most horrifying is that Abraham does kill his son. That his hand is not stayed. By the way, who stays the hand? We know that God told him, you go and sacrifice Isaac. Who stays Abraham's hand in the biblical story? An angel. It is not the Almighty. The rabbis there even have something that God was ashamed, because he knew all along Abraham would do this. He was ashamed and could not speak to Abraham. So one of the rabbinic midrash say that Isaac has been slaughtered, is dead. This is why Abraham comes down alone, and he says nothing to the two servants waiting below. The two servants waiting below. Who were they? Again, usually we have Moses did something and Aaron and Miriam were there, or Joshua was there. It's always telling us who was there. But in this case, we've got a mystery. We've got two individuals who are told, stay at the bottom. You can't come up here. This is only for Isaac and myself. Who were they? Midrash tell us that they were Eliezer, his trusted servant, whom Abraham had determined, since he had no children, Eliezer would inherit the spiritual and physical riches that Abraham had. And the other one was Ishmael, his other son. And the reason they can't come up on the mountain is because Eliezer, Ishmael, Yitzchak, we have a spiritual growth. Eliezer, who was at a particular spiritual level, but not even close to Abraham. Ishmael, who was the child of Abraham himself, who had learned from his father certain things, certain spiritual lessons, so that when he is effectively dying in the desert, it's his voice that the Almighty hears, not Hagar, who is wailing off beyond him, so she can't even look at him. God hears his silent voice. So there is a spirituality there, but again, not of the degree that Isaac is. So you have accompanied us this far. Isaac and I need to go up the mountain. And then Abraham comes down alone. And in silence, he and the two servants go back to Beersheba. One of the stories tells us Isaac is dead. The other stories are equally interesting. One is that Abraham's hand is stayed, and the reason that Isaac is blind is because Isaac actually sees the radiance of God. He actually, as the angel is saying, don't kill him, he actually, like Moses sees the backside of God passing before him. In this case, that's precisely what Isaac sees. And this is where the rabbis say that God is turning his back because he is ashamed. But the radiance blinds Isaac. It's why later on in the story, he's blind. And it gives rise of certain individuals who will say he's feeble-minded. Third story, and this is my favorite. And as a child learning Midrash in Cheder, I took our Chazan, who was my teacher, I took him to task. The third is Isaac goes down the other side of Mount Moriah. It will lead him towards the coast. And there he goes and he studies in a yeshiva in Yavne. Well, first of all, Yavne didn't exist. It doesn't exist until the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. So it didn't exist, and the whole concept of yeshivot didn't exist. But I loved it, and I pointed this out to Cantor Waldman, and he looked at me, and he looked at me, and then he gave me such a knipple. Those of you that don't know what a knipple is, it's you take the fat of the cheek and you turn it, and you can give a little one, it means, oh, isn't it cute? You do a big one, it's like, shut your mouth. So these are the three possibilities that the Midrash give us about Isaac. The only one that makes sense is the middle one. That he sees the radiance of God and he remains up there. He's stupefied. Now, later on, we know that although he is blind, he can still determine who comes before him for him to give his blessing. Now, we know that Rebecca, has manipulated things. She sent off Esau into the desert, to hunt wild animals and bring it and make a stew for your father. In the meantime, she has already helped Jacob make a stew. She's taken the fleece of the animal, put it on his arms and on his chest, because we're told that Jacob was virtually a hairless man. It also suggests that, we tend to think of the patriarchs with big beards. Jacob may not have had a beard, or just little remnants of a beard. But whatever, Rivka does all of this work to make certain that she can pull off a trick to get her favorite son, Jacob, blessed. And he goes in and he presents his father with the stew, and he asks his father for his blessing. And Yitzchak reaches out and he touches the person there, and he says, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the body, the hairy arms, that is Esau, and he gives him his blessing. Now, what's wrong with that story? If somebody loses one sense, what happened to the others? They become more heightened. And so we know that hearing a voice or smelling something, that is going to be intensified, and you're going to recognize a thing, a person, or whatever else. Here again, we turn to the Midrash. Tell me something. How did Jacob know what to do in front of his father? And how did his father recognize that it really wasn't Esau? And we are told that it was not simply the voice, but it was the smell. That Jacob had the smell of Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden. Now, what do you think Eden might have smelled like?
Rotten fruit.
Okay. Rotten fruit. Somebody said apples. Or you wait for the wind to fall. Alrighty, apples. And yet, in the Garden of Eden, was it an apple?
No.
It simply says a fruit. There again, we've got to go to the rabbis. The rabbis determined it was a pomegranate. A pomegranate, because a pomegranate, the rabbis say, have 613 seeds on the interior. Hello? All of the mitzvot of the Torah, all of the commandments. So, but whatever the smell, whether it was apples, whether it was pomegranates, whether it was simply that fresh smell that you will get in a well-tended garden, that is what Jacob smelled like, as opposed to his brother. And the rabbis tell us what he smelled like. He smelled like not necessarily animals, but he smelled like animal dung. And then that a woman who is married to a camel driver and who cleans up because of his camels only has to sleep with her husband once a month. But that's a whole nother story about halakha. So here we've got Isaac, and suddenly we know a little bit more about him. From his earliest childhood of being a child who is pampered, who is given everything he wants, who wants to please, to this young man who helps his father to bind him on the altar, and who then is undoubtedly going to go on, have his own children, and be able, because of the lack of sight, to recognize things by heightened senses. Very interesting character, far more three-dimensional than the two-dimensional cardboard figure that we get of him in the Bible itself, in the Torah itself. Let's move on to the second character, Shaul HaMelech. Even as a child, I always felt that King Saul represented one of the greatest tragedies in Jewish history. What do we know about King Saul? Sorry? Not his father-in-law. It's David's father-in-law. He was not simply an insomniac, but we would call him today bipolar. He was a manic depressive. He had wondrous moments where he was just happy and wonderful, and then he would fall into the depths of despair. And one of the things that helped him, and this is how David is introduced into the household, is that David sings and he plays the lyre. What else do we know about King Saul? That's about it.
For me, he was rich.
Actually, he wasn't. Yeah, we tend to think of kings, riches. He wasn't. As the first king of Israel, he's getting into the idea of kingship. Anything else that we know about him?
He built the temple.
Nope, that was Solomon. Any other things that we know about King Saul?
Well, he was a warrior.
He was a warrior. He was a warrior king, and his constant enemy were the Philistines. And he was always at war with them, trying to protect Israel's integrity as a nation. So he was a warrior. He was the father of Jonathan and several other children. How many wives did he have?
Probably too many.
How many wives does King David have? Well, David is the one who had an entire stable full of wives. He was a true medieval potentate. David has 4 wives. Saul has 1. David has constant problems with his children. Saul's children, with the exception of David's love for Jonathan's love for David, his children are obedient. So we've got these 2 men. They're almost being compared to one another.
Who was Saul's wife?
Saul's wife, she is unnamed.
Here we go.
As opposed to David's first wife, Michal, who is the daughter of King Saul. We know about her, and she's actually blessed in the Talmud because she derided David for dancing half naked in front of the Holy Ark. Okay, what do we know about King Saul? He was from the tribe of Benjamin. Now it's interesting because right there we've got to put the story into a broader context. In the book of Judges, there is a passage that is absolutely frightening. But it gives us somewhat of a history of King Saul, of his background. Now, the story deals with a Levite and the Levite's wife or concubine. And he is traveling through the hill country of Ephraim, and he's got to go through area that was part of the tribe of Benjamin. And he gets to a town called Gibeah, and he asks the people, please, will anyone take us in for the night? It's dangerous country up here. Everybody closes their door. And suddenly one man approaches. He's been out in the fields, and he approaches, and he says, I'll take you into my house. And he takes him into his house. And shortly thereafter, there is a crowd around this man's house. And the man goes out, and he says, what do all of you want? He says, you have a stranger in your house. We want to have him out here. We want to know him. Is this beginning to sound familiar, like another story? And this Benjaminite says, please don't do this. It's not right. Because the crowd, which was all men, wanted to rape this man, this Levite. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And earlier we know that it's part and parcel of the legacy of Abraham. Here it is the exact same story. And the man says, I've got a virgin daughter and another daughter, and we have his wife, and we'll send them out to you, and you can satisfy yourselves with them. And they say, no. So the Levite goes in, and he brings his wife out. He says, here, have her. He closes himself in the house, and the entirety of the night, that crowd gang rape this woman. And in the morning, just barely alive, she comes back to the door. She falls right there at the door. Her husband opens it in the morning, and there she is dead. He's appalled.
Really?
Isn't that interesting? So he then decides, my honor and the honor of Israel has been besmirched. And so he takes her body and he cuts it up into 12 pieces. And he then sends it off to the 12 tribes. And he demands that they send men to help teach the Benjaminites a lesson. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. There's a war. And the rest of the Israelites almost annihilate the tribe of Benjamin. 400 men are left. And they suddenly realize, how are we going to reproduce? And so the Lord says, there is a Canaanite town near here. Go in and by the sword, kill every man, kill every woman who has known a man, and then bring the virgins back to your town, and that's how you will repopulate. And the Midrash tell us that King Saul is descendant from that, from these non-Jewish virgins being brought back and coupling with Israelite men. Now, the story is a horrible story, and if you ever want to be appalled, the book of Joshua and the book of Judges are horrific books of the Bible to read, because they talk about genocide. They talk about murderous misogyny. This particular story, though, is important because, again, it gives us a comparison with David. Who was David's female ancestor? Ruth. Ruth, who was of Moab, she was not Jewish. When did she convert? Well, the rabbis say her conversion happens when she refuses to leave Naomi. And she goes through that beautiful passage, whither thou goest, I will go. That is her moment of conversion. And she is viewed from that point on by the rabbis as being Jewish, and everything that she does to help her mother-in-law. And it is from her union with Boaz that we will get King David and the Messianic line. It is from this murderous, bloody, rapist story and the midrashim around it that we will get King Saul. And so even though before the comparisons, number of wives, children, whatever else, it seems in favor of Saul, when we look at the Yehes, when we look at his full background, we actually can see that he is from a background that is rather salacious. Now the story begins, Saul's father tells him, our mules have disappeared. Go look for them. And Saul goes off to look for the mules. And along the way, he bumps into Samuel. Samuel, who was the last of the judges, the first of the great prophets. And Samuel tells him, I don't know where your mules are, but you're going to be the king of Israel. Just like that. And Saul looks at him and he says, what? Because he knew that Israel has been asking for a king for well over 200 years. And that Samuel has told the people and the elders, you have one king and that is God. You cannot have a king. It will lead to the worst possible consequences. And he says, the consequences would be, he will use all of you as his servants. He will use your men as cannon fodder, as soldiers. And he will gradually not respect God's laws. But the people demand it. And seeing Saul looking for his mules, Samuel knows, God tells him, that is the future king. And he anoints him. And then later, Saul is revealed to the people. Similar story with David. David's out looking for his sheep, comes home, he finds Samuel there, who has been looking at all of Jesse's other sons, and he turns to David, who is a boy, and he says, you're the next king of Israel. And he anoints him on the spot. So these two stories are very, very close in a lot of ways. Why, though, is Saul's a tragedy? Well, any human being who is afflicted with bipolar problems is an individual who is not completely in control of his or her emotions. You will have those moments of ecstasy when you will celebrate, when you will sing, you will be great company, and then you have those moments where you will be so down that you may try to kill someone, which is what he does with David. You will not recognize the intense love that your son has for David. You just can't see this. And so from that standpoint, from a mental illness standpoint, he is a very sad individual. But even more so, he is an individual who is lost without the father figure of Samuel. Whenever Samuel is not near him to let him know what God wants, he goes into one of his depressions. Now we've got to stop and think. How can Saul not know what God wants? He is God's anointed. He is God's chosen leader for the people of Israel. And we turn to Midrash. And the Midrash that Saul was incapable of hearing God's voice. That he was incapable of knowing what God wanted of him because he was intensely afraid. He never once had that incredible encounter with the divine presence. He had to have it mediated through Samuel. Now Samuel tells him, the Almighty wants you to go out and to smite Amalek, the Amalekites. Let's stop. Who are the Amalekites? Nobody? Like I say,
Yeah, it does.
Amalekite, yeah, it sounds like the stone, but they were they were desert people. And when Israel was coming out of bondage from Egypt, they attacked the rear, and the rear was made up of the sick, women who were getting ready to give birth, the elderly, and children. And they struck that, and they killed great numbers of them. And because of that, we have the passage in Deuteronomy that says, it says, Zachor, remember what Amalek did to you when you were in the desert. And at the very end, it says, do not forget. And we have been told that the Amalekites are the mortal enemy of the Jewish people. And in the time of Moses, in the time of the judges, the Amalekites were still around. And so Samuel tells Saul, you are in to go out and to destroy the Amalekites, men, women, children, their animals, destroy their city, blot them off of the face of the earth. And Saul, the warrior king, decides, I will do this. I will do mighty as asked. And he takes his army of 200,000, and they go out and they smite the Amalekites. But they keep some of the women as trophies. Saul, to show how magnanimous he can be, spares their king and several members, male members of the royal family, brings them as captives back. To each of his soldiers, he gives at least one sheep and one cow to thank them for the hard labors in this battle campaign. God had told him through Samuel, destroy them all, everything that they own, and burn it. Why would Saul decide that he, a warrior king who had this command from Samuel, who had it from God, why would he not carry through? We turn to the Midrash. Saul, as he was about to finish the extermination of this people and of their animals, the rabbis tell us he suddenly had this little glint, a memory. And the memory was, Hashem, Hashem, Kirachum V'cham. Our God is a God of mercy and compassion. It's the 13 attributes of God that we repeat over and over and over again on Yom Kippur. He suddenly remembers this, and he decided, God is compassionate, I will be compassionate. It's a very noble thought, but we are often taught we should not do and assume unto ourselves that which the Almighty does not want us to do. Just think to the two sons of Aaron, who, wanting to praise God, went in behind the curtain with fire and incense they were not supposed to have, and they were struck down dead. When Saul comes back, Samuel comes into him, and he looks at him and he says, you have sinned in the eyes of God. He doesn't have to tell him what the sin is. Saul knows. And then, as if to put icing on this cake, he tells Saul that from that time on, he has lost his kingship. Not that you're no longer king, you're still king, but God is removing from you the blessings and the sanctity that a king of Israel should have. And then he takes Saul's sword and he looks at the king Agag of the Amalekites, and he literally cuts him into little pieces, throws the sword down and walks out. That is the last time Samuel sees Saul. And Saul goes into one of his deepest depressions. Nothing can bring him out. Until almost at the end of 1 Samuel, there's going to be a war with the Philistines. And Saul, the warrior king, must get his forces together. And the night before the battle, he decides that he must know what the Almighty has in store for him and for Israel. And so, with several individuals who are with him, several servants, Isaac with servants, now we've got Saul with servants, they climb a hill towards a little village called Endo. And in the village of Endo, there is a woman who is a necromancer. She's a witch. She can conjure the dead up. And he goes into her and he says, I want you to bring Samuel back. I need to speak to him. And so far she's not recognized the king. By the way, the king who had almost killed every necromancer, every witch, he had survived. And she hasn't recognized the king yet. And so she says, okay, I'll do it. And she brings Samuel back, and the story in the Bible says that Saul is absolutely speechless. We turn to the Midrash. Why? Well, you know this woman can bring the dead back, so that's not going to be a surprise to you. But it's the manner in which they come back. We will expect to see a specter like we are. Head up here, feet down there. Samuel comes back upside down. His head is down below, and the head gradually rises so that he is seeing, Saul sees Samuel, but he's upside down. And Samuel says, why are you disturbing me? Why have you brought me back? Don't you know the law? Strike two. And then he tells Saul that because he doesn't hear God, that his kingdom is lost and he will die in battle, and his entire dynasty will go with him. You're finished. and then Samuel sinks back into the earth. It's only at this point that the witch of Endor recognizes King Saul. And she tries to comfort him, but there is no comfort because he knows the future. And he knows what his future is going to be. And he goes back down to his army and he prepares for battle. Now, can there be anything more tragic than this figure knowing I am going to lose the battle? I'm going to lose my life. My sons who are fighting with me are going to die. And you go into battle that way. And he goes into battle, and he fights courageously, and as we know, he's killed. But it's more than his murder, more than the killing of the king. On the news, you may have caught some of the horrible things that ISIS is doing. And one of them is, after people are dead, they're tacking bodies to crosses. They're crucifying dead bodies and slicing off the head. And that is what happens to Saul and his sons. Not only are they killed in battle, but stop. How is Saul killed? We've got 2 strikes. He kills himself. He commits suicide. Strike 3. It suggests that he will forever live in a state of damnation because he took his own life. But the Philistines then take the body, they behead it, and they tack it to a wall. And it is there that eventually the Israelites will find their king's body and the prince's bodies, and they will give them a proper burial. But it's an incredibly tragic story. And it is filled out by comparing it with other stories within Tanakh, as well as looking at the Midrash about this individual. Esther. What do we know about Esther?
Time for a happy story.
It's time for a happy story. Okay, time for a happy story. He's got to enter it. Has to enter it at some point.
She had a name change, Hadassah.
Okay, her real name is Hadassah. It's not Esther. And Mordechai, we don't know what his real name was, although the Midrash tell us it was Abraham. They've got different names. However, Esther, where's the name come from?
Was the name different because she was being given to the kingdom?
No, this is what it says, that her Hebrew name is Hadassah, and she was known as Esther. Okay, Eseteo, we can find a Hebrew meaning for it, meaning I will hide, i.e., she's a closeted Jew. But even more so, we know linguistically that Esther comes from Ishtar, which is a Persian goddess, a goddess of fertility. Mordechai?
We're not sure of my relationship.
Well, we're not sure of his relationship, but his name is Marduk. It is another Persian god. What we're dealing with here are not profoundly observant Jews. They are Jews who have integrated themselves into a broader society. Esther knows that she has another name, Hadassah, and the name Esther, I've got to hide myself. Okay? Mordechai, a good Persian name. So we're dealing with Jews who are highly assimilated in Persian society, and they are near enough to the inner circles, the inner workings of Persian society for Esther to be invited to be amongst the beauty queens that will walk in front of the king to try and find a new wife to replace Vashti. Okay, what else do we know about Esther? She's some sort of orphan. Her relationship with Mordechai, is it her uncle? Is it her first cousin once removed? And there is even, according to even Ezra, one of the great medieval commentators, he was probably her Levitical husband. That Mordechai's brother had actually been married to her before the marriage was consummated. he died, so Mordecai had to marry her according to the laws of Leviticus. Whatever, a strange relationship with this guy. Well, the marriage was unconsummated, so we take certain rabbinic commentaries with a bit of a grain of salt. What more do we know about her?
She's saying it to people.
Does she really?
Well, that's the story.
Who is the person who actually gives the information to Esther of what has to be done? Mordecai. She's basically his proxy. She speaks for Mordecai the very few times that she does speak. We have a book in Tanakh named for a heroine who is a secondary character in the story. Even when they're celebrating, it's the king and Mordecai celebrate and Esther is there. Ooh, dance. What more do we know about her?
Is she a good dancer?
No, nothing about being a dancer or not a dancer.
Relationship with Vashti.
Okay, first of all, let's start here. The idea is, wasn't she sort of attractive? Okay, the story itself doesn't it tells us the story, the biblical story, she's comely, meaning she was good looking. But Midrash goes even farther. And it says that she was spectacularly beautiful. But her beauty was both exterior and interior. So she has this vibrant neshama, this vibrant, beautiful soul, and she also is physically attractive on the outside, so much so she did not have to put on any makeup. Okay? We had something about her.
I'm talking about the relationship with the queen.
Okay, does she really know Vashti? Doesn't know Vashti, doesn't know what Vashti did. What happens to Vashti, by the way?
Isn't she exiled?
She's exiled, and most likely by Persian law, she was exiled, taken out of Shushan, the capital, and probably killed. So Esther is really never going to know her. Esther is courageous. When she has to, she will break with convention. The queen is never supposed to go into the king's presence unless she's called. And yet, she does that because she wants to invite the king to a supper so that the whole plan that she and Mordecai have worked out can come together.
So with your description of her, she bedazzled the king into not paying any attention to the day of the rose, right?
Oh, no.
No?
Maybe. We're trying to get the happy ending. Maybe he was attracted to her. Maybe he was so infatuated because they're newlyweds. You know, we'll forget the fact that he has a harem of hundreds of other women. But nonetheless, he's infatuated. He sees her standing there, and he puts up his scepter. She comes in. Would any of you have had the chutzpah to tell the king that his trusted minister, Haman, make noise now. Thank you. That his trusted minister, in fact, wanted to kill not only the Jewish people, but her.
Every woman in the sisterhood would.
Good for you ladies. Okay? But you know, here she has got to speak the truth. And she shows just how courageous she could be. Now, how many dinners does she give?
It's more than one.
It's more than one. Okay? We know that on the first night, she says nothing. She is absolutely silent.
Are you talking about Midrash now? Or
No, in the biblical story. In the biblical story. Second night, she finally has found the courage to tell what needs to be told. So there are two dinners. The king, though, has gone out. When he first hears it, he is so overwhelmed. And when he comes back in, where's Haman? Haman is there, and he's all over the queen, begging her, please, take all of this back, save my life. It is not so much what Ahasuerus hears, but what he sees that condemns him. Because he's looking in, and here is this man who is all over my wife. We turn to Midrash. And the Midrash tell us that Ahasuerus knew, and that this action of Haman's of being all on top of the queen was simply additional proof to how unfaithful a servant he was. It's really sad that even Midrash doesn't have more to tell us about Esther. But it's that way with almost all of the women. Women are viewed as being, if you're married, your husband's property. If you're not married, you are your father's property. And we can see that the individuals who wrote Tanakh, who wrote the Midrashim, as men, didn't fully understand the female psyche.
Still don't.
We're getting better. We're getting better. But nonetheless, it says that women are made to appear inferior, subservient. And yet, without those women, without Sarah, without Rivka, without Esther, without that virgin who was a non-Jew, without Ruth, Jewish history wouldn't have happened. Dvorah in the book of Judges. Exactly. So even though I've only talked about one woman today, and the information we have of her both in Tanakh and in the Midrash is limited, we also have to have that overview that without you ladies, it don't happen. Gentlemen, remember that. I'll look at any of you gentlemen out there, remember that. Be it your mother, be it your wife, be it your partner, whatever. So, that is what I have to say today about 3 Jews that you thought you knew a lot about. I hope you know a little bit more about them now, and at some point in the not too distant future, perhaps we can do this again. So, with all of that, I will say thank you very much.
Anybody with questions?
I have a question. The book of Esther is not part of the Torah as we put it together today, is it?
It is. It's not part of the Torah. It's part of Tanakh.
It is.
It is. That's why you find it in that. That's the English translation. It is there. Jerry.
In geological time, you're talking about seconds here from your biblical history curve.
Sure.
Why? I mean, that's not. Why isn't like God with the Palestinians, smiting them, shooting bombs into Israel? Why
Some of the modern rabbis, and this would actually begin with going back to say the Vilna Gaon, 18th century coming through the modern era. They indicate, why don't we hear the Almighty today? Why doesn't he speak? He does in some ways, but we're not understanding it. And other rabbis have said, we have already been given all of the rules and mandates by which to live, by which to act amongst ourselves as a Jewish people in the rest of the world, and that should be enough. We were like children then, we're now early adults.
The majority of Israelis is secular. Don't you think a little minor miracle could turn things around?
Well, what could be more of a miracle than the very fact that Israel exists today? That in the 6-Day War, there was this incredible lightning victory that should not have happened.
In 48 too.
Well, the war, I mean, every 6 to 8 years, there's another war in Israel. They're getting closer together now with Hamas. But, you know, those can be looked upon as being modern miracles.
Can they undergo?
Technology.
That's technology, but exactly. We did the Iron Dome with our TOHCs. But no, but that's what some of the rabbis will say, that we have all of the principles by which to live by, and we don't need such boom, splitting of the Red Sea or whatever else. We don't need those kinds of miracles today. And miracles that occur, scientific discoveries, technologies, come from the human mind that are inspired by something beyond it. That is the view of most of the rabbis. Except we have a rabbi here who might be able to elucidate a little more.
With a spectrum of belief on God, I encourage you to go back and begin to study, because that begins to really help you answer your question. It also depends on what you believe about God. Answer that. There's a spectrum of belief. If you are a Catholic, you have one answer to your question. If you're a classic, belief that God is omnipotent and omnipresent, you have another belief. If you have a Spinoza view of God, we have a real spectrum, and your answer is based upon your own belief in God.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Pleasure.
This has been recorded.
Oh.
It was for posterity.
So as it's being recorded, we have heard that Dr. Seidelman will be coming back.